Gather round now, children, and let the fire crackle just a little louder tonight, because the wind outside has a story to tell, and it is a story of a woman who never knew the meaning of the word quit long before the paved roads reached these Blue Ridge Mountains, and long before the humming of machines filled the air. There was a silence so deep you could hear your own heart beating against your ribs. My grandmother May was a woman of small stature, but she walked with the weight of 1,000 souls. In her weathered hands she was what they called a mountain midwife, a woman who walked between the worlds of the living and the unborn, and she did it all with nothing but a leather bag and a faith that could move the very peaks we stand upon. I remember one winter night back in 1924 when the snow was piling up against the door frame like white sheets of iron. A knock came at the door, not a polite knock but a desperate pounding that shook the very foundation of our cabin. It was young Elias from over the creek. His face was pale as the moon and his breath came out in ragged ghosts of steam. He didn't have to say a word. May already knew the look of a man whose world was about to break apart. His wife Sarah was struggling and the mountain was holding them captive in its icy grip. May didn't hesitate. She reached for her heavy wool coat and that old leather bag that smelled of dried lavender and antiseptic. She looked at me with eyes that were clear and steady, and she told me to keep the kettle boiling and the prayer going until she returned. I watched her disappear into the white swirl of the storm, a tiny shadow against the vastness of the winter. She had to cross the creek where the ice was thin and treacherous and climb the ridge where the wind howled like a wounded beast, but May had a rhythm to her walk, a steady pace that she had learned from years of tending to the earth and the people upon it. She used to say that every life is a spark that needs a little bit of shelter to catch fire, and that night she was the only shelter Sarah had. When she reached their cabin, the air inside was cold and the only light came from a single flickering candle. Sarah was exhausted, her strength fading like the last embers of a fire, but May stepped into that room and the atmosphere changed immediately. She didn't bring fear, she brought a quiet authority that silenced the panic. May sat by the bedside and took Sarah's hand. Her fingers were rough from gardening and chores, but her touch was as gentle as a falling leaf. She whispered stories to Sarah. Stories of the women who came before them, of the grandmothers who had birthed nations in the wilderness and the mothers who had survived the leanest years. May told her that she was part of a long unbroken chain of strength and that the mountain might be cold but the life inside her was warm and ready. For hours the battle went on between the shadows and the light. May moved with a grace that defied her age, boiling water, preparing herbs and humming a low melody that sounded like the wind through the pines. It wasn't just medical skill, it was a spiritual labor, an act of love that refused to let go. Elias sat in the corner, his head in his hands, praying to a God he had nearly forgotten, but May stayed focused, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. She saw the moment when the spirit almost wavered and she leaned in close, whispering that the dawn was coming, and with it a new song. She told Sarah that the pain was just a tunnel and on the other side was the sunshine of a new face. And then in the darkest hour, just before the sky turns gray, the first cry broke the silence. It wasn't a weak cry but a bold, defiant shout that echoed through the small cabin and out into the snowy woods. May held the tiny bundle close to her chest, wrapped in a scrap of old flannel, and she smiled a smile that could have warmed the entire valley. She handed that baby to Sarah, and for a moment the cold and the storm and the poverty of the mountains didn't exist. There was only the miracle of breath and the peace of a mother's gaze. May stayed long enough to make sure the fire was fed and the mother was rested. Then she walked back home as the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. When she walked back through our door, her coat was frozen stiff and her face was lined with exhaustion, but her eyes were shining like stars. She sat down by the fire and let me take her boots off, and she told me that she had seen the face of hope once again. She taught me that being brave isn't about not being afraid, it is about showing up when the world is at its darkest and holding a light for someone else. She spent 50 years traversing these hills and she never lost a single mother because she believed that every soul deserved a witness to its arrival. She didn't have a degree and she didn't have a title, but she had a calling that was written in her blood. May lived through the wars and the droughts and the changing of the world, but she remained as constant as the granite under our feet. She saw the horses replaced by cars and the candles replaced by bulbs, but she always said that the human heart stays the same. It always needs a bit of kindness and a hand to hold when the journey gets steep. Even now, when I sit on this porch and look out at the mist rising from the valley, I can almost hear her voice in the rustle of the leaves, telling me to be brave and to stay true and to remember that we are never truly alone as long as we have each other's stories to carry us through the night. She died on a quiet afternoon in autumn just as the leaves were turning to fire, and she went out as peacefully as a sunset, leaving behind a legacy that isn't measured in gold but in the generations of children who grew up strong because she was there to catch them. So when you feel like the storm is too loud or the path is too dark, just think of May and her leather bag walking through the snow with a heart full of grace and a spirit that couldn't be broken, because her story is your story too, and the strength she had is the same strength that flows through you today, just waiting for its moment to shine. And so the fire burns low and the night grows deep, but the warmth of her memory stays right here with us, tucked away in the quiet corners of our hearts where the truest stories live forever and ever. Sleep well now and dream of the mountains and the women who tamed them with nothing but love and a steady hand, for the world is wide and the stars are bright, and you are part of a beautiful enduring song that will never end as long as there is someone left to tell it.